The USSR, also known as the Soviet Union, was for much of the 20th century a world superpower and fierce rival of the United States and Western Europe, being locked in a constant ideological battle, competing through means of proxy wars and a technological arms race. This all ended in the early 1990s after a series of failed reforms by Mikhail Gorbachev to restructure the stagnating Soviet economy, open up the press and allow free criticism of the government, and democratize the country by allowing the election of non-communist politicians. These reforms were to signal the dawning of a new age for the lands of the Soviet Union, one which went as far as to propose the creation of a new union entirely, the Union of Sovereign States. Rising from the ashes of the USSR, it was intended to be a freer, more democratic entity than its predecessor, one that wouldn't have to be communist. But as we can all probably tell, based on its absence from modern maps, this new union failed to manifest. Toward the USSR's final days, as the new union plan had begun to take shape, an attempted coup erupted from Moscow, led by hardline communists, the chaos and confusion of which allowed several of the USSR's republics to break away after decades of abuse and neglect. One by one, the Soviet republics followed the alluring beacon of independence, leaving Russia behind, diminished of its strength and influence on the world stage. This power vacuum was quickly filled by NATO and the EU, who proceeded to spread their influence into Eastern Europe, right up to the Russian border. Today, we still think of Russia as an intimidating force, and perhaps even still the West's leading military rival. But behind its imposing size and massive nuclear arsenal, Russia as a nation has assumed a secondary role in global affairs, and has understandably receded to merely a dominant power in its geographical neighborhood, still holding close ties with some of the former Soviet republics, but no longer holding sway over the world as it once did. But what if that changed? What if Gorbachev's reforms had succeeded and managed to rebuild the Union so that it might survive to the present day? Before we get started with this scenario, you might have noticed this isn't the same deep soothing Mr. Z voice that you're used to, and the editing style may be different. My name is Neatling, and I have my own YouTube channel where I cover alternate history as well as other topics that I find interesting. Mr. Z was kind enough to invite me over for a collaboration, so I'll be your host for today. If you enjoyed the video, do consider checking out my channel. Links will be in the description and in a video card here. But with that said, let's get back to the scenario. So, how could Gorbachev's reforms have succeeded? The key event that led to the collapse of the Union seems to be the 1991 August coup, where, as we said before, hardline communists attempted to forcibly retake control of the USSR from Gorbachev's reforming government. For the new Union plan to succeed, this would have to not happen at all, as the coup left the USSR in a state of total disorder, ultimately leading to the USSR's collapse. But the root of the issue goes further back. The USSR's economy had been stagnating for at least a decade, and living conditions were worsening across the country. When Gorbachev opened the press and allowed people to criticize the government, they immediately showed discontent, which just fueled separatism and hatred towards the government. Gorbachev and his government would have to delay glasnost and democratization till a later point where the economic restructuring would have had time to do its thing and fix the stagnant economy, preventing a knee-jerk reaction from the public before the job was even done. Perhaps perestroika might have worked if only it had time to run its course. So in this scenario, the USSR opens up the press and begins democratization later in the mid to late 90s, when the economic situation would presumably be much better and the public less resentful. This is also when the Union of Sovereign States would be established, and elections with other political parties than just the communist one would be held. Some issues arising would be inevitable, however. Some republics with very distinct cultural identities, such as the Baltic states, Georgia and Armenia, as well as Moldova, would want to leave the newly established USS, which Gorbachev's administration would still allow. The reason these republics would leave and others wouldn't is complicated, but in the case of the Baltic states and Moldova, it was because of their strong cultural identities, and them feeling that their culture and language were threatened by the large influx of Russians during the USSR. Other republics that would choose to stay, such as Azerbaijan, did not have nearly as large a Russian minority. Meanwhile, Ukraine as well as Belarus were extremely close to the Russians, both linguistically and culturally. A great real-world indication of which republics would have stayed with the USS, and which ones wouldn't, is whether or not they participated in the drafting of the new Union in our own timeline. Although much of the Union would stay together, one thing that wouldn't is the Warsaw Pact. As soon as elections are allowed in the member states, non-communist parties would be elected into government, and there would no longer be the same ideological reasons for keeping the pact together. The people in East Germany had also always wanted to reunify the country, so as soon as democratic elections were held, they did just that. The immediate effects of this would, much like in our timeline, be a sudden shift in world politics. The USS would still be left much weaker than the former USSR, as it no longer has control of Eastern Europe, and would be scrambling to re-establish control over its immediate neighbors. This would mean that for the coming decades, the world would be fairly unipolar, with the United States as the sole superpower for some time. Europe would also see major change, as democracy and capitalism would sweep across the continent and spread to places like Poland and the Baltic states. This is also what would allow the expansion and restructuring of the European coal and steel community into the European Union. Greater Russia would still recede, but despite losing their sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, they'd still maintain greater solidarity with the majority of their constituent states, and be in a much stronger international position than in our world. The economy, for one, would be in a better state, as it would keep Central Asia as well as Ukraine, Belarus, and Azerbaijan. These lands would for one give the USS a very large geographical buffer between Moscow and potential foes, which makes conquering the nation practically impossible. Ukraine would also provide the USS with a lot of fertile land and easy access to the Black Sea. Central Asia, while less important economically, much like Ukraine, provides the USS with even more fertile land, especially in Kazakhstan, as well as access to the Middle East. But perhaps most importantly, Central Asia, along with Azerbaijan, gives the USS almost complete control of the oil-rich Caspian Sea, which would benefit the nation greatly. There are things in this world which would likely be very similar to ours. For one, the USS would not become a Western-style open democracy, as characterized by the United States' sphere of influence, but more centralized, with accents of autocracy, which have historically remained a characteristic of Russian government. In all likelihood, it would become very oligarchical, much like Russia in our own timeline, and Putin, along with a sort of catch-all political party with no coherent ideology, but more of a vague Russian conservatism, could very well rise to power as well. It would, perhaps to an even greater extent than in our world's counterpart, have a strong sense of Russian nationalism as well as Russian irredentism. This very nationalist ideology, combined with Russian irredentism and the strategic value of creating a very large geographical buffer, is what would lead the USS to expand its sphere of influence in the late 90s and early 2000s. This here is essentially what the USS would want to control. The region of most interest would be Eastern Europe, as the greatest defense of Russia has always been a massive buffer between Moscow and its enemies, where all invading forces have been defeated through attrition. But what effect would these changes have specifically? Well, Russia, or the USS, would be a very different world player than the former Soviet Union. The Soviet Union supported communist regimes across the world, and had close ties with faraway nations such as Cuba. But unlike the Soviet Union, the USS would not have the same ideological motivation to support regimes so far away. The USS would instead be focused on remaining the dominant power in Eurasia, through subjugation of its neighbors, and the acquisition of new alliances. Rather than overstretching itself in an attempt to achieve global communism, it would attempt to give Moscow and the core Russian lands as much of a territorial buffer as possible, and more resources to work with. This would help the USS in its attempt to avoid complete Western dominance over Europe, as well as complete Chinese dominance over Asia. And this would certainly have an impact on NATO, as well as the European Union. NATO would expand much like in our world, as the newly founded post-Soviet nations bordering the USS would be even more at risk of falling right back into the Russian sphere of influence without outside support. But much like in our timeline, not all would join NATO, and those countries would likely face a similar situation that Ukraine has faced in our world. A conflict in Moldova would arise, as they have a significant Ukrainian and Russian population in the Transnistria region. Support of a Transnistrian uprising would be used as an excuse for war, leading to the USS invading and integrating Moldova, with Transnistria joining the state of Ukraine within the USS. This event would mark the beginning of this Russian expansionism and re-establishing of Russian dominance in Eurasia, as they leave behind Gorbachev's perceived weak policies that led to the former USSR losing so much of its sphere of influence to the West. Russian policy going forward would be one of discrete expansion, growing their network of alliances and opposing the West. The Russo-Georgian War would also happen in this timeline, but would escalate further as the stronger USS would feel more emboldened. The USS would have Abkhazia and South Ossetia join them as autonomous sovereign states, while Georgia would be occupied and integrated as well. The USS would also find an excuse for occupying Armenia to properly regain control of the Caucasus, as well as solve the issue of the Azerbaijani enclave surrounded by Armenia. These conflicts surrounding the USS, as well as the USS being much stronger than our world's Russia, would lead to NATO expanding to more countries that fear Russian expansion. Finland would for instance join NATO, and European countries would spend more on defense. But NATO would not be bold enough to involve itself directly in the conflicts in the Caucasus or Moldova, as war with the USS would mean mutually assured destruction. This allows the USS to regain some of its lost sphere of influence, and establish itself not as a superpower like the US, which involves itself all over the world, but as a powerful nation in its own region, which has a firm grip on much of Eurasia. For many nations close to the USS that end up at odds with the West, the USS would also be an appealing ally. This would allow the USS to expand its sphere of influence to new places which weren't in the Soviet sphere, such as Iran. But in the late 2000s and early 10s, things began to change as China rose in the East, making the world increasingly multipolar. And that would be the biggest difference between this world and ours, how it would eventually become even more multipolar. Russia, or the USS, would be one of the great powers, and not in decline in the same way we see Russia is today. This would all make relations with the West very tense, but the rising China would make the geopolitical situation even more complicated. The USS and their allies would in all likelihood have nominally good relations with China, as they're both anti-Western. But no direct alliance would be established either, as their interests wouldn't always align with one another, and the rise of China could also threaten the USS. The USS standing as its own power would also limit Chinese attempts to expand their sphere of influence. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative would be much more limited in its scope in this world, and become a much more lackluster road initiative, as it would be unable to create the belt across Central Asia, which is under USS oversight in this timeline. The Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a Chinese attempt to create a more China-centric world economy by expanding infrastructure and transportation between China and the rest of Eurasia as well as Africa. In exchange for many of these big infrastructure projects, China also attempts to gain influence over many of the nations along these trade routes by giving them loans they can't repay. But with the USS and its ally Iran blocking all land routes between China and the rest of the continent, this wouldn't be possible. Instead, China would attempt a similar strategy, but only focused on the maritime routes through Pakistan and southern Asia. This could perhaps limit Chinese expansion and growth in the coming decades, but it would also allow the USS to become a more significant trade power, as it would be the only land-based link between Asia and Europe. If the USS were to focus on expansion of its infrastructure and creating new trade routes, like China wants to do in our timeline, the USS would have the potential to grow significantly in wealth in the coming decades. The Russians would also see this focus on East-West trade as being a sort of revival of the old Byzantine Roman Empire, which they had already seen themselves as a successor of since the age of Russian czars. The Byzantines were for centuries the bridge between East and West, and now the USS would pick up that mantle. Gorbachev's reform succeeding would simply give Russia the opportunity to be a major player in the increasingly multipolar geopolitical landscape that is forming. It could be one among many powers like the US, China, and perhaps later down the line, India, all competing for influence. Should the US go down an isolationist path in the future, a European-centered NATO could also arise as its own power. With European countries more able to defend themselves, the US may not see protecting Europe as being valuable geopolitically, and a split between the Americans and Europeans could happen sometime in the near future, making Europe its own independent power, although this is highly speculative. Regardless, this multipolar world would be a reality much earlier than in our own timeline. Today, in 2020, the USS would already be a formidable regional power, and perhaps the third largest economy in the world, behind China and the US, or fourth if you count the European Union, which would replace China in second. Gorbachev, while still controversial, would have saved the Union's economy and allowed it to exist in the 21st century. In our world's future, it's increasingly likely Russia will fall further and further behind the US and China, leading them to either having to just stay an isolated regional power with few allies, or pick a side. They're also in a situation where they're almost completely surrounded by Western-aligned nations, and their GDP is lower than even Canada, Brazil, and many much smaller European nations. But in this world, they would have a large buffer zone between Moscow and the West, and be much more capable of establishing themselves as a major economic and military power. This better economic situation would have assisted in halting the stagnant and dropping population growth, In our world, Russian population growth has been slowly bouncing back in the past few years, but in the USS in this timeline, it would happen earlier. And of course, the USS would just have much more territory than Russia in our timeline. Accounting for this, its population would be around 320 million, fourth in the world, and only slightly behind the United States. Or of course fifth if you count the European Union. This obviously shows that the USS would be a lot more formidable than our world's Russia, with more than twice the population, higher GDP, and much more vast oil and gas reserves. But that's just about all for now. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to Mr. Z. Also consider checking out my channel, Neatling. Thanks for watching, see you around.